Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of SMIE Consulting's Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Roundup, we'll be taking a look at three top issues in this week's international education news from the last 7 days. We'll get into those in just a couple of minutes. What I'd like to do first is say a big hello to everybody who's watching on live on Facebook and watching the recordings either on YouTube, on our channel, or on the Facebook page. And it's really an honor to be coming before you each week to share my views on these issues that are affecting our industry and international education. And I really want to spend the time today talking about those things that are important to all of us in the field. And for those not familiar with the Midweek Roundup, this is part of the services that SMIE Consulting provides to the larger international education community. And each Monday, as part of those services, we provide a weekly newsletter called the SMIE, All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And this provides our take on a few of the top stories. We usually do about 10 to 15 international ed stories, as well as 4 to 5 social media stories that and the possible implications for what we do in international education. So that is a regular part of what we do on Mondays. That comes out 9 a.m. Direct to your inboxes for those who subscribe to the newsletter. And then we take 3 of those stories each Wednesday for our focus for the Midweek Roundup. And this week, we're going to be taking a look at Travel Ban 4.0, the 6 newest countries that have been added to the list of travel ban countries the current administration has put in place. We'll look at what that means for higher ed. We'll look at the unicorn of international education, and that would be having a national U.S. international ed policy. And a decent article from NAFSA that goes into a lot of the different implications of national international ed policy from other countries' perspectives, and from what the moving parts are in the United States that would need to be a piece of that discussion, and the potential variations on the theme that might exist in the U.S. And we'll wrap up with an insightful article about international student mobility trends in the coming decade. This is an interview largely taken from Rahul Chadha, one of our favorite international educators, and certainly one of the best thought leaders in the business in terms of looking at the future implications of what we do in international ed. So we'll wrap up with that article at the end and some of the implications that has. Now let's get started with the travel ban. This is the what NAFSA calls a Travel Ban 4.0, and this first was obviously introduced at the end of January. The implications of it were starting to pop up in the last week. This Inside Higher Ed article kind of briefs you on the overview of what's involved with this travel ban and the countries that are impacted. We're talking here about virtually all would-be immigrants from Burma, Eritrea, Kyrgyzstan, Nigeria would be prohibited from entry, and then nationals of Sudan and Tanzania could not come to the United States as part of the diversity visa lottery program, which has been a target of the current administration in its entirety. So those are 2 kind of different variations on the theme there. None of these 6 countries, much like the original 7 or 6 as it turned out to be, were impacted student visas that this student and visitors were exempted from this travel ban. So on its face, it's not a ban on, it's not going to prohibit students from entry into the United States in legal terms, though as we've seen with Iran, that ban on Iranians coming to the United States has not applied to students either, but has been one of the most problematic of the countries involved in terms of a lot of different variables involved, obviously the current political situation, military situation. But even though there is no ban on students who qualify for visas, get them from the U.S. embassies abroad that would accept Iranian nationals who are domiciled in Iran, they have had a world of trouble coming to the United States legally on visas, and often been deported, as we reported last week, after arrival at the United States, and given insult to injury, given a 5-year re-entry ban by DHS, by CBP. So some obviously troubling issues on that respect, but for these new 6 countries that, again, not impacting students directly, it's interesting to see how these stories get intertwined and often confused. But the overall impression, as Esther Bremer, the CEO of NAFSA, indicated in the Inside Higher Ed story, that though the policies do exempt students from the ban, the overall impact of these messages does not certainly present a very welcoming view of the United States as for international visitors, for certainly would-be immigrants. It puts them in a very different category. It exempts many of the citizens of those countries that would want to come to the United States from even having that opportunity. So what is the stated aim? Obviously there are 2 sides to every story, and with this, the stated aim of these travel bans, and you look at the initial countries that were on this list, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, Somalia, all of those countries can easily be seen as either failed states or states that are highly antagonistic towards the United States, and some of that's self-induced, some of that's just their own impressions of the United States. But those countries, for whatever reason, however way you look at it, kind of made sense in some respects. But some of these countries that are on this current list, particularly Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the top sending countries to the United States in terms of students. The most recent Open Doors data had them at number 11 on that list of sending students to the United States. Again, students not impacted directly by this ban, but the reasoning given for the ban, including these six new countries, similar to the previous ban, is that those countries are not providing the adequate information on their nationals that are applying for U.S. visas, that the U.S. does not have access to criminal databases or other national databases in those countries to vet applicants for U.S. visas. So the interests of national security are what on face have been given by the administration for why these 6 have now been included on this list. So Nigeria, for international educators, obviously poses the most significant implication here. And it's always good to point out that there are a number of resources out there that are worth checking out. One of those is NAFSA. They have a travel ban advisory on the different in their resources, NAFSA resources section. Walks through what the actual wording of the bans are, who's affected, who's not impacted. For example, the travel ban 4.0 does not impact, as we said, non-immigrant visas like F1 or J1 visitor visas. H1Bs are also exempt from this, so that's the good news. But it does provide all the different variations on what NAFSA's positions have been, the actual proclamations, and what the wording is. So I do invite you all to check that out if you do have questions. It's really important. And again, with all the stories that we cover here, we put the links to them in the comments section on the Facebook page for SMIE Consulting. So do check those if you need the direct references. Part of this travel ban story is a little bit interesting when you see one of the major countries, Nigeria, that we covered, and the impact on that nation. BBC had a story that came out shortly after the ban on February 1st that detailed Nigeria's response, that Nigeria's President Buhari has actually suggested they are going to comply with Trump's new visa rules. So because he wants to have productive relations with the United States, he's appointed a minister to lead a committee to study and address the new visa requirements. And again, this is for security concerns on the U.S. part in our ability to vet any applicants for visas that were coming from these 6 countries and others to the United States. They weren't getting the right level of cooperation. And the way the acting Homeland Security Chief Chad Wolf laid it out, these countries for the most part want to be helpful, but for a variety of different reasons simply fail to meet minimum requirements that were laid out. These rules actually come into effect on February 21st of this month. So that is something that we'll obviously keep an eye on here on the on the roundup. But as part of the security issues involved here, Mr. President Buhari in Nigeria has signaled his willingness to cooperate. So. And this will be a good test. We know Iraq, these travel ban countries, is not a permanent list, and the way they've always been portrayed is that when countries meet the minimum requirements, security requirements for the United States in terms of information sharing on visa applicants, then they can be taken off a list. Iraq was on the original travel ban in January 2017, and that was taken off. Iraq as a country was taken off the list shortly after in 2.0. So we're seeing changes being made that if those security arrangements are up to the U.S. standards, then those countries can be removed from the list. It has happened before, and hopefully in the case of Nigeria, it will happen again. Because there is the concern, rightly so, and Esther Brimmer from NAFSA makes this case very well, that it almost, with these travel bans, it certainly paints a very negative impression of the United States as a welcoming destination, which is antithetical to what we are in international ed, particularly in the U.S., for our college campuses. And she makes the point that it makes the United States seem like we're closing to the outside world. And that's obviously something in international education circles would result in massive job losses around the country, over 400,000 job losses if that were ever to be the case, as a result of international students no longer coming to the United States. So we'll keep our eyes on this one, and as it develops, and certainly update here on the roundup if any of these countries meet the requirements that the U.S. government sets out and get themselves off the list. So next up is a story that has always been one that's been close to my heart. For those who know me, I've been involved, particularly when I was on the higher ed side, in forming state consortia in Indiana. Was involved in Destination Indiana, becoming a force in the early to late noughts, 2000s. So. Really, we found in Indiana we were having we dropped to I think 13th place on the Open Doors chart in terms of destination states for international students, and that's when we formed Destination Indiana in 2002, and over the course of the next 6 years, Indiana rose from 13th to 10th in the country as a top destination state. And through our collective efforts, through our incredible cooperation we had with Education USA, working with our U.S. Senator, Richard Lugar, absolute legend in international ed circles, international affairs circles, who sadly is no longer with us. But he helped us really get our state on the national stage, international stage, in fighting for international students. And that's something that some other states have also done similar things, but there's never been really a national movement. There have been individual states, but never a national movement to coordinate international ed policy. And there are only two ways it's going to happen: either from the grassroots up, as part of a kind of a collective work of the various states with loosely defined national, federal association or committee. It's never going to be national policy in this model. The others is a top-down. If it gets to become a huge priority for the government or a national priority to internationalize our campuses, much like you see what Australia has done, what New Zealand is doing, what the UK has done in the past, what Canada is about to do or has been putting in place the building blocks for. The article I've just posted the link to is another NAFSA article. It's actually a fairly lengthy piece and does kind of paint a very broad, goes into a lot of the broader details and issues involved in this, as to some of the challenges why implementing an international ed policy in the U.S. is very difficult and if not impossible, as well as what it might look like in the United States to have something like this. It talks about the various, states taking the lead, as one option, and then having kind of an umbrella association. And we've talked here on the Roundup about this before. Last May at the NAFSA conference in D.C., the U.S. Commercial Service, as well as the, various state consortia groups, formed a national association, which is still in its infancy, but it's USA, a study destination. The organization itself, initial purposes are to kind of organize and help support the various state organizations, and then as more of an inward focus as an organization, and then hopefully talking to Gabriela Zelaya from Commercial Service, who is one of the leaders of the new national consortia. This is kind of a phase 2, phase 3 of becoming more outward focused in terms of policy issues, in terms of promotion of our different states, our obviously our institutions, but we're not really sure where that's going yet. But we hope and wish it something like that can be that ground up piece that does have some at least federal support, loose federal support to help garner a more broad-based, policy-motivated organization. So what's the future here? What we see in the United States are really 4 different agencies, federal agencies that have roles in international education in one way or another. Certainly in many other countries, the Ministry of Education, higher education ministries, departments, branches, whatever you call it, have some sort of a role in international education, but that's certainly not the case with our U.S. Department of Education. It's really focused on grants to support outbound Fulbright Hayes and other programs like that. It also has doesn't have direct oversight over U.S. accredited institutions. It is a kind of a clearinghouse for that information, but it doesn't have that role itself to accredit institutions. So that authority's not there. You have State Department, who has a public diplomacy mission and promotes U.S. higher education through exchanges abroad, various programs it manages, but also through the Education USA network, and has funding for Fulbright and other programs. So there's that, but they don't have kind of domestic policy foundation authority or ability. Some of that is with Department of Ed. Some of that is with Department of Commerce that sees higher education as an export industry, and there's always been the talk of the billions of dollars of revenue that are brought in to the United States as a result of international students coming, spending their money on tuition, on room and board, on other expenses, the jobs that support those students while they're in the United States that I referenced earlier. So they have a role in promoting U.S. interests abroad. Then you have Department of Homeland Security, which manages the policy implications that are set by Congress, and then interprets them as it impacts immigrants and non-immigrants coming to the United States being let into the country. Obviously, State Department also issues visas, but the Homeland Security are the ones that actually physically control, as we've seen with the Iranian students' cases, whether students can actually enter the United States legally with valid visas. So a lot of different moving parts. So a very good article that kind of paints a very important picture of some of the struggles and challenges with having an international ed policy in the United States. So I do certainly recommend giving that a read, because it does really touch on a lot of the things that we see as real challenges in our industry here in the United States. Hussein, thanks for joining the Roundup this week. Hope you had a great birthday yesterday. It sounds like you did from your post today. So happy to have you on, and didn't realize we're the same age. So I'm glad to have you as a fellow 50-pluser. So next article is coming out of the Pi News, and again, one of my favorite sources for international ed knowledge. And this one is very different. It's talking about, it's actually a story about that surveyed the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. So these are board of trustees that are surveyed on their opinions on different things, and there were several questions that were in this survey related to U.S. immigration law, international student recruitment, and so there's some really interesting things here. Relates a little bit to what we're talking about with international education policy in the United States, that many institutions in the last decade and a half, they've seen just huge expansions in students coming from China, and that's led a lot of institutions to see and really see international ed as a incoming international students as really a fundraiser, a budget balancer for their campuses, and that's obviously it comes with its own challenges. This article is talking to not the actual administrators who do the recruitment or even the presidents who impact policy or what institutions or how committed institutions will be to international student recruitment, but really the board of directors, board of trustees at these different institutions surveyed. Some of the interesting comments that came out of this is 22% of these trustees reported there being a major impact from policy shifts in the current administration on international student enrollments. Another 50% said that these policy shifts have had a minor impact on their institutions, on the number of international students enrolled at their institution or in their systems, campus, if they're state systems. It also looked at 85% of those surveyed that they had concerns with the financial sustainability and price for students and their families, and that up from 73% in 2018. So 85% identified financial sustainability and price as the most significant issue, most pressing areas for their institutions. And internationally, that's certainly the case, and many of us in the business know this. Talking to some colleges that when asking them to help me out with one of my consulting opportunities to write an article about scholarships that students can get in the United States. They said we won't be a good example there because our discount rate is terrible. It's only like 16% for international students maximum, so from their total cost. So this is something that's a real challenge because you see internationally there are very few institutions that offer full financial aid for international students. There are a larger number, probably 1,000, that will institutions that offer some form of scholarship to international students, but the maximum amount of those scholarships isn't really keeping up with the rise increases in tuition. So there's been some moves, and certainly as I advise my university clients on what do they need to be doing to make themselves more attractive to international students. Part of that mix is making top scholarships at least half. For international students, at least half of your tuition bill, and then having progressively lower amounts from a third to a quarter that you make available to make yourself financially competitive with not only other institutions in the United States but other countries. U.S. is already the most expensive place for international students to study. Yes, they get a lot more for their money perhaps here in the U.S., but they don't know that until they get here. Unless they've had other friends or family that have gone to the U.S. and have all these other services and such. But that's why, one of the main reasons why the U.S. costs so much is because of everything else we do beyond the classroom experience for international students and all students really. So this Board of Trustees piece is interesting because you have a quarter of Board of Trustees respondents that said that they believe, particularly at private institutions, that their institution is spending too little time recruiting international students, and that's really encouraging to see that. I wish it were a larger percentage, but to see Board of Trustees folks that are really removed from the day-to-day of what's going on with recruitment, may not see the full breadth of what's going on. Maybe are also realizing they need to be doing more. Their institutions need to be doing more when it comes to international student recruitment. And I've been at institutions where Board of Trustees took a very direct role in what we were doing in international ed, but I've also been at institutions where the Board of Trustees really didn't even factor in their overall impressions that international student recruitment was not even on the radar as far as a priority for that school. So it'd be interesting to see how those times are changing. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that story, because I'm sure that won't be the last we hear of that, and I'd be interested to see how those numbers change year on year. Now, the final story we'll cover today is an International Student Mobility Trends report. And this one is from a new publication, University to Business, U2B, and it features basically an interview with Rahul Chadha of study portals, but also he's been in the international ed circles for many years, and is really one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the great thought leaders in our profession. Certainly one I look to whenever we get to some of the macro trends that impact our industry. And he's come up with four major trends to be aware of. One, that change is the only constant. That there are really growth and sustainability impacts, as we saw with the trustees, that there are lower prospects of work, particularly in the United States. You hear potential changes to H-1B, what's already happening with OPT, and restrictions to that, and delays in processing, all of these things that are impacting the current students in the country. Those factors get back to future students as a potential roadblock to their enrollment here. You think about the higher cost of education. Just spoke about that with the trustees piece, but now you're also seeing this as not just more institutions getting into the game, but also more institutions seeing student recruitment more by international students as dollar signs, and that's always going to be an issue. Number two, he says, is demand for better ROI. And for many of us in international admissions, when we think ROI, it's like, what's our return on our investment for what we do with our recruitment trips, what we do with social media, with print or web. But this is a different ROI. It's the ROI of proving to your prospective student audiences that you can actually deliver, that you can you can provide what you say you're going to provide when it comes to employment, preparation for careers. All of these things are vital. So it's going to be an interesting to see how much the universities start to prioritize that, not just for their domestic students, but their international students as well. So we'll see where that goes. Not too sure that that's going to be a real priority. Third is the importance of China and India. They are the mama elephant and a baby elephant in the room, if you will. The two most populous nations in the world that have driven success or failure at the major destination markets: U.S., U.K., Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand. We are all heavily dependent on China and India for our international students, and impacts that rulings or changes in policy, or rumored changes in policy, can have on the rise and fall of interest from different countries is driven. Are we overly dependent on those two countries? Yes, because they're the two biggest countries in the world, and there isn't a nation that's recruiting international students that wouldn't put value on both of those countries as sources for their student populations, inbound student populations. And the final piece that Dr. Chadha mentions is education disrupted, and what he calls the fourth wave, where he says digital disruption will really begin to bear on international student mobility trends and patterns. This is the influence of technology in addressing affordability, access, diversity issues in international ed. And he gives some very useful advice that we must treat international students not as one monolithic block or dollar sign, that we need to understand different markets have different needs and are adjusting our policies accordingly and recruitment strategies accordingly. And this is something I preach to my university clients as well, is you need country level plans for your major markets that you're going after that involve a multi-layered approach to recruiting students, and messaging needs to be different. And that needs to be facilitated yesterday, not in 2 years or 3 years. And he mentions pricing and how our financial aid policies need to be adjusted accordingly. So some really solid feedback, obviously, from Dr. Chadha, as always, in preparing us for what's to come. So I do want to say that for those of you who've been listening on the podcast, thank you so much for subscribing. Really makes a difference to me in keeping me going, and seeing that the subscriber numbers increasing, both for the podcast but also for the newsletter. It's always good to have some folks commenting back on either through personal messages or on the Facebook page. So thank you very much for that. And we'll continue to provide these as we can each week for the roundup as well as the newsletter. So looking forward to continuing the conversation at a convenient place and time for each of you. Have a great day. Cheers.